So last Sunday, I chose a text from Amos as one of my top 10 scriptures for my understanding of Christian faith. That was number 8, in part based on an inspiration from Marcus Borg, who recommended Amos as the best starting point for doing a Bible study on God's vision for the church today and for the world. This morning, for number 7, my inspiration comes from John Dominic Crossan, who many of you know was a very close friend and associate of Marcus Borg. And Crossan, who is widely seen as the most influential historical Jesus scholar in the world today, was our guest preacher on our Cornerstone Sunday back in 2011 to celebrate the centennial of this building. And for me, I don't know for you, but for me, it was just a sheer joy and one of the highlights of my career to host him. Well, Crossan told us at that time, back in 2011, that as an academic teaching in a public university, he had not been invited to preach for 30 years. He had been a Franciscan priest, or Dominican, forgotten now which, prior to that, but left the priesthood and became a professor. At any rate, it was Marianne Borg, the wife of Marcus Borg, who invited him to preach when she was on the ministerial staff at Trinity Cathedral in Portland. I think that was in 98 or so. And so he thought to himself, if this is the only time that I get to preach on a Sunday morning, or if I only had one sermon to give, thinking that he might never be able to preach more than twice in any one location, right? What text would I use? What sermon would I give? And he immediately thought of Psalm 82. And conveniently, it turned out to be a great text to use for our Cornerstone Sunday. Surprise, surprise. So in preparing for this sermon, I went back and I was reading some of my notes that I have taken from listening to Crossan over the years, going up to Portland to hear him, to Yakima, to Berkeley, to Albuquerque, even as far away as Turkey on a tour I took with him and the Borgs. So yeah, I'm a bit of a Crossan groupie. Some of you already know that. But at any rate, I was going through all these notes and I found some notes that I took from back in 1998 in Orlando, Florida, when he gave a sermon. Guess on which text? Psalm 82, right? So it turns out he wasn't kidding. This is the only sermon that he gives wherever he goes. So why is Psalm 82 so important? Well, let's read the text. I invite you to follow along in your own Bible or in the Pew Bible. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. So first, just a note about this idea of the divine council, because I think it's a little bit of a foreign concept for us, unless you're thinking of the Trinity, and you have this image of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit in a little meeting together, right? But the whole idea of a council of gods with Yahweh at the helm actually appears in many places in the Hebrew Scriptures. The story of Job, after we're introduced to what a righteous man he is, takes us to this divine council, where God is in conversation with the accuser about whether or not he is as he appears to be. In Psalm 58, we read where it condemns the gods who judge unfairly and deal out violence on earth. It's interesting. In 1 Kings 22, the prophet Micaiah describes a divine council in which God agrees to send a lying spirit into the royal court, the prophets of the royal court, in order to encourage King Ahab to go to war. And then Ezekiel condemns the ruler of Tyre for claiming to sit among the council of gods. So here in this psalm, we are told that God has now dethroned all the other gods for failure to do their job. Now, in the polytheistic culture of ancient times, it was, of course, common for one tribe to claim that their god was superior to the other tribe. And usually that came especially after some battle, right, in which they were victorious. And emperors throughout the ages would give credit then to the gods for their victory in battle. When I took our group on the World of Paul tour to the Mediterranean world, I took them to this place on the western shore of Greece, to where Octavian dedicated an altar to the god of war, Mars, for the battle of that defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra, the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and it was that battle that ended the Roman Civil War, and Octavius then becomes Augustus Caesar. And so today you can see the foundations of this temple with its inscription dedicating it to Mars, the god of war, and artists have provided us with a helpful description of what it would have looked like in its original time. And we need to remember, of course, that long before there was Nike, a shoe company, right? Nike was the goddess of victory. And so it is that athletes and politicians often claim, or give credit to God for their victory, because human victory reveals divine favor, or so we think. But what if God is not revealed through contest, be a battle, a game, or an election, but rather through conscience? What if God is known not by military success, but through moral character? And if so, what would that character look like? So Psalm 82 could not be clearer. This is the job description for God. Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And those who do not do so are not worthy of the divine name, the psalmist declares, and hence they are then kicked out of the divine council. The New Interpreter's Bible sums it up this way: the establishment of justice and righteousness is the measure of divinity, and not only that, the author continues, but also of human life as God intends it. So how then do we read the psalm today? One way Christians have interpreted this psalm is to read it in the context of the final judgment, when Christ shall judge between the nations, as in that scene from the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, when the sheep are divided from the goats. And so the final verse of the psalm reads, "Rise up, O God, judge the earth." And that then is interpreted as the day of Christ's ultimate exaltation over the earth, when he shall judge the nations. Really? I mean, why is it that we have to Christianize Hebrew scriptures in order to find meaning in them? Is the text not clear enough without our needing to read Jesus into it? So I was preparing for the class that I'm teaching in the previous hour on resurrecting Easter, when I ran across a quotation from this psalm that helped me to see it in a different way, that adds meaning to it from the Christian perspective without taking anything away from its original meaning. So in the region of Cappadocia in Turkey, how many people have been there? Oh, no, we didn't go there. Sorry, I didn't take you there. That was one of the places we did not see. Yeah, this doesn't look familiar, right? This is a World Heritage Site, and there's this volcanic tuff, T-U-F-F, of rock left behind that is soft enough that you can dig in it. And so during the Byzantine period, Christians created these churches inside the hills, dug out, and created these caves, and then adorned them with these incredible frescoes. These are over 1,000 years old. And they're wonderful scenes, very familiar to us, of biblical stories. very similar to that of the Sistine Chapel, except this is 500 years before Michelangelo. And in this one scene, there is the crucifixion, very familiar, and then below it is this quote from Psalm 82, "Rise up, O God, and judge the earth." Only it's not a reference to that crucifixion scene above, it's rather a reference to a now lost scene below as the fresco has crumbled into the dust of eternity. So what was that scene that has been lost? Well, fortunately, it's not hard to recreate because where that quote is in the bottom right-hand corner, we can see 4 heads. 2 heads on the left are the kings David and Solomon, nicely labeled above their heads. On the right is John the forerunner, and in the middle is Christ, labeled with the monogram used for Christ. So, are there other scenes that we can find from this period with those individuals in it? And as a matter of fact, there is. In the next door, in another church that's called the Dark Church because of its lack of light, there is a scene of the resurrection that portrays the kings, David and Solomon, on the right. You can always tell David because he has a crown and he's bearded, and Solomon is clean-shaven. And on the left are Adam and Eve being pulled out of their graves. And this is called, falsely, the harrowing of hell. Harrowing from the Old English to till or to disturb. So the disturbance of hell. I'll come back to that in just a moment. In the Cora Church, now a museum, that was built first in the 5th century, greatly expanded in the 10th, and then these frescoes added in the 14th century, we see this same scene of the harrowing of hell, Christ pulling Adam and Eve out of their graves, and on the left are David and Solomon, and between them in the brightly colored robes and Christ is John the Baptist. On the other side are other individuals. So we see then this collection of John, David, Solomon, and the risen Christ. This is labeled, here you can't see it very well, anastasis above the head of Christ, which typically we translate as resurrection, except that it's unlike any resurrection, right, that we have seen. Although this is the predominant way that the resurrection is portrayed in the Eastern Church. Always with Adam and Eve being pulled out of their graves, then along with others. Now, I say wrongly this is called the harrowing of hell because that would mean that Adam and Eve have been in hell all this time, right? Which would be absurd. So it's not hell that is being raised with Christ or is being harrowed by Christ, but rather it's the abode of the dead. And that's a totally different concept. And there under the feet of Christ, you can see Hades personified as the keeper of the dead. And I'll use the other image from the Dark Church because you can see it better. But Christ is standing on top of Hades, who is now shackled in his feet and his hands. And then off to the side, you see the broken chains and locks and doors of Hades that Christ has broken. So if you Google anastasis, you will find numerous variations of this very same scene with different Bible characters portrayed, but always, always with Adam and Eve. Sometimes in each hand, sometimes with Adam first, with Eve close behind. So call it by its Greek name, anastasis, for in this Eastern tradition, the raising of Christ is not just the resurrection of God's Son, it always includes Adam and Eve and the rest of humanity, as this artist from the 15th century, I think, has attempted to portray. Only take note, in this anastasis, then, there is no dividing of the sheep and goats. Instead, all of humanity is raised with Christ. And so too, Psalm 82 concludes, "For all the nations belong to you." So if you want to find out more about this, just come to the class next week in the in-between hour and you'll learn more. Or you can buy the book from John Dominic Crossan, Resurrecting Easter. But so it was over 1,000 years ago that some wise mystic of the church, painting on the ceiling and the walls here in this church carved out of rock, a scene that reveals the ultimate character of God by raising up all humanity with Christ. So how then shall we read this psalm today? So I think Christ does show us the way in a story that's told in the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. And there, the religious authorities are threatening to stone Jesus for blasphemy. And Jesus responds to their threats by citing his good works and asks, so which of these good works are you going to kill me for? And they respond, well, it's not for your works, but rather it's for your claim, quote, making yourself God. And Jesus, this is interesting, Jesus then replies by quoting Psalm 82. Is it not written in the law, I said, you are gods? If those to whom the word of God came were called gods, can you say that the one whom the Father has sanctified and sent into the world is blaspheming because I said I am God's son? If I am not doing the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, even though you do not believe me, believe the works. So what are those works? Are they not the very thing proclaimed by the psalm in this job description of God? The one who gives justice to the weak and the orphan, to maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute, to rescue the weak and the needy, to deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And remember what Jesus said in that first inaugural sermon in Nazareth? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, release to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, and to let the oppressed go free. If you want to see an illustration of this, if you want to see Christ at work, if you want to see what God is doing in our world, even in our recent history, watch the movie Harriet. Judy and I just saw this Friday night. It's the story of Harriet Tubman. Incredible story. And I knew that Harriet Tubman was one of the heroes of the Underground Railroad, but what I did not know was the way in which her faith guided her in doing that work, quite literally. And I find it very fascinating that Hollywood portrays this story in such a way, and I won't give it away, watch it for yourself, but if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about, the way they show how her faith guided her and these visions that she received, that's not inconsequential to the story. It's quite central to the story. How this tiny woman, a fugitive slave, at great risk to her life, personally led 70 others to their freedom. So without revealing too much more for those who have not seen it, there's this powerful scene at the end of the movie when she at last confronts her former slave owner. And now the tables are turned. And she is the one who holds the power of life over him. Harriet. Just Harriet. She holds the power of life over him. I don't know if this is factual, right? It's Hollywood after all, but I know it's true, right? And she says to him, based on these visions she has received, you will die right here on a frozen, blood-soaked battlefield. The moans of a generation of young men in your ears, dying in agony around you for a lost cause, for a vile and wicked idea, for the sin of slavery. Can you hear them? God don't mean people to own people. Harriet Tubman is the personification of this psalm. And in her we see the work of God. And yet, denying her rightful place on the $20 bill, the injustice to Harriet Tubman and the effects of the sin of slavery continue to this day. But Harriet would not quit. With conviction in her cause and confident in the will of God, she continued to fight until justice is done, and may we continue to advocate for her until her image is on the $20 bill. Right? So know this, followers of Jesus, where justice is given to the weak, where the hungry are fed, where the naked are clothed, where the homeless are given shelter, where systems of oppression are challenged, where swords are beat into plowshares, where death is defeated by life, where prejudice is overcome by truth, and hatred is overwhelmed with love, there the character of God is known and the work of God is done. So rise up, people of God, and claim your faith in the one who is victorious over the powers of death. Rise up and give witness to the one who gives justice to the weak and maintains the right of the lowly. Rise up and stand with those who strive for freedom and a life free of violence, slavery, and poverty. Rise up and confront those who oppress the poor and promote their racist ideologies and vicious lies of anti-Semitism and white nationalism. Rise up in the court of God's justice, where all nations belong to God and all are loved by Christ. Rise up with Harriet Tubman. Rise up with Emmett Till. Rise up with Sojourner Truth. Rise up with Martin Luther King Jr. Rise up with Nelson Mandela. Rise up with Mahatma Gandhi. Rise up with Dolores Huerta. Rise up with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Rise up with Oscar Romero. Rise up with Harvey Milk and Matthew Shepard. Rise up with Mother Teresa. Rise up with all the saints who have given witness to God's love and justice for all.